Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Pastor Danny, and thank you for joining Elisha's Bears. I thank you for listening to the podcast and also following the podcast, and I'd encourage you to do so. If you haven't done it already, I am terribly excited today to have Meredith Miller in the studio. Meredith, how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me.
We're doing this a couple of weeks before the General Assembly in Chattanooga, and so I look forward to seeing you in person here in the very near future. We're going to have three state bodies coming together, and I know you're going to be the keynote for that. Let me see if I've got some of your bio. I want to share that a little bit. You've been with the Fuller Institute since 2007. You've been the curriculum director for children's ministry at Willow Creek Church in Chicago. You have a Master of Divinity from Fuller. You have a Bachelor of Arts degree in Religious Studies and Spanish Language and Literature from Westmont College, and you're also serving as a pastor in Southern California. Did I get all of that right?
Those are all true things. Yes.
Part of the bio, and I love what you said here. You said, I'm Meredith, a pastor and a parent who helps grown-ups and the kids they love engage with the Bible and faith in ways that are life-giving, fun, and a fit for their real lives. And I love all three of those. I want to get into the book in a minute, but I'm
Sure.
showing my age a little bit by giving a shout out to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood
Love it.
and Fred Rogers and the trolley and everything. I see you're
Yes.
smiling, so you're on board with that.
Indeed. I mean,
Okay.
Fred Rogers is, I think, a real important figure when it comes to childhood and faith for sure.
Well, I think he was interviewed by Oprah, and Oprah asked him, what mistakes do parents make in raising their children? And he said, not remembering our childhood. What do you make of that?
I think that has become increasingly true, right? If he was right then, it's even more right now because the world we grew up in um, is not the world our kids are growing up in. And so when we can't remember even just how things felt, what it was like to try and be kind of learning how to human, I think it really gives us a disadvantage to come towards the kids in our life with a sense of curiosity and compassion because the world they're in has the same challenges we all experienced growing up, and then it has new challenges because of the massive shift in technological norms and school expectations that I think are even more challenging for young people now than they were at any point in the past. And so that memory, I think, ties us, if we're able to, I think, a posture that would be really helpful with our kids of like, hey, tell me what the world's like for you. Because I both remember that it was hard for me at times. And I maybe remember adults who did or did not understand me and what that meant, right? To be listened to well by an adult or what I wish I would have had. If that was not someone's experience, there's just only good to be had from trying to remember what it's really like to be 8 or 10 or 12. And so many of us rush past that.
Okay, that sounds good. The reason you're here is I want to talk about your book. It's called Woven, Nurturing a Faith Your Kid Doesn't Have to Heal From. That's nothing ambiguous about that. It's I'm trying not to oversimplify here, but it seems like the foundational premise of the book is based on a run-in you had with a spider in which you were apprehensive and now you're appreciative of them.
I've become appreciative even though I don't like spiders. Well, and part of that is because I am aware of how much of the conversation around faith for parents right now intersects with the conversation around deconstruction and reconstruction. And those construction kinds of metaphors, I think they have their uses and then they have their limits. One of the limits, I think, is the rigidity of those construction metaphors, the degree to which we all start with a blueprint where we've predetermined what we're going to have and build, and then we end up getting something that looks like the blueprint. And spiders' webs don't work like blueprints. They are crafted in totally unique ways. So I ended up kind of down a rabbit trail of like literal spider's web research. And one of those pieces is that like spider webs are like snowflakes. No two are alike. They are famously strong. And so the MIT nerds who want to do that thing about figuring out spiders were trying to kind of figure that out a bit more. And their conclusion was that they're strong because they're flexible when stressed.
Okay.
And I contrast that with, I think, a lot of the ways people are describing faith changes through their life as being like they're in the rubble, like everything has come tumbling down. That out of the extension of the construction metaphors, there's no space for change or challenge because you're supposed to kind of soldier on according to the formulas you were always told. And I just found it very captivating to think about mental models and images that invite us to be be more responsive to how life actually works, that we have questions, that we have crises. And so the spider's web became the guiding metaphor for the book, partially because of its ability to reflect uniqueness, partially because of its way to speak to what does it mean to talk about giving kids a strong faith or a resilient faith, and partially because it works well for adapting to change. When a web is woven, it expects breakage. It never is crafted for timeless shape. It's gonna break and then it's gonna be rewoven. And we would never want to be in a building where that was the plan for its four walls and roof. But
Right. Right.
so I loved all those things despite my lack of love for a spider itself.
Well, see, I enjoyed your book and I was going to show you that I had it physically, but my deacon chair saw it and has it, and he is reading it now.
Wonderful.
So I wanted to mention that and say it's making the rounds in our fellowship. But one of the things, and I guess I'm asking this on his behalf, all
Mhm,
right, but he was noticing how you wrote about, and you may have just spoken to this, how a spider, when the web is damaged, they repair it rather than destroy it.
mhm.
And you were just saying that's a little bit like faith, isn't it?
I think it's a really helpful way to think about faith. If a spider had to start from ground zero every time there was damage to the web and they had to build one all over again, it would die. It doesn't actually have an energy capacity for a full blown start to finish web over and over and over again. It has to go with repairing damage. And when we face whatever it is that sort of breaks a part of our faith, whether that might be, I was told the Bible always works this way. And then I start reading these biblical scholars who are just adding all kinds of new thoughts about the way this book actually functions. But I was always told, this is the right way to read the Bible. And then there's
Right.
some breakage. Or it might be about faith practices for some people, right? Like I grew up in the era where the quiet time was the be all end all faith practice. And then when I got to a time in my young adult life when I couldn't really do that, I didn't have a lot of other options. I had not experienced a variety of ways to pray, a variety of ways to create space for God. I had to kind of relearn that idea that is, again, not all that new. You think about Gary Thomas's work with the Sacred Pathways as just one example of saying, hey, we've got options. But when you've only got a certain set of practices and then you kind of stop having those work for you, then it's like, well, there's this breakage to how I thought faith worked. And sometimes it's about who we thought God was. And I think, especially for children, they're introduced to God, and no adult is ever going to get that totally right. We don't actually have this full and comprehensive view of God. And that's in and of itself a great thing, right? To say, hey, and God is always more and mysterious and beyond. But then they're told, hey, God's like this. And something along the way makes them think, well, maybe God's not totally that way, for good or for ill. And so then there's this breakage. And I think the idea that part of what gives a web its strength is that there are these anchor strands holding on to kind of places that are going to keep it secure. I think we can really lean into who God is, even while other parts of our faith might really need some repair or some reexamination, some reweaving. And yet that doesn't mean our whole faith is destroyed. We still have what we do know about God. We still have the pieces that we can lean into. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing equation. And I think that that can be a lot of relief for a lot of us. I think that can give us some much needed grace for the fact that our faith is often process. Those questions are often, we carry them for a long time. And that's true at every age.
Yes. Well, of course, the whole purpose of the book, it seems, is to nurture healthy faith. And maybe this is by implication or inference, but Meredith, do you think it's possible to nurture an unhealthy faith?
Well, certainly. I think it is possible to use things that sound Christian, Bible verses, or saying that God thinks or feels a certain way in order to try and control someone. And kids, especially, they're wired developmentally to take the word of their trusted adult as true. And so you can decide that if you are really most of all concerned about something like behaving properly, you could attribute to God a great concern for a young child's good manners and proper behavior. And when that gets internalized as what God really is like or what God really cares about most, I think it can be very hard to then expand into getting to know who God maybe really is more, better understand what the story of scripture really is about. And so I think there are ways that it sounds like faith, but it's got other goals in mind that are more
Yes.
convenient for the adult.
Right.
So yeah, I think in that sense, there's a lot of unhealth that is possible.
This is interesting, the timing of our conversation, because I was talking to a young family in our church, and they have an 8-year-old, and I've dealt with this sort of thing in my work as a pastor, and I know you have as well. But one of the questions I get, and I went through this because I have 3 kids, and I'm gonna bring that in a moment, but talking to parents who have children who may be close to making a salvation decision or experience or whatever language you want to use, and there's a concern that they've come out and said, "Danny, I don't wanna mess up," or, "I don't wanna do the wrong thing." What do you tell parents who have children who are asking salvation type questions?
I think it's really helpful to have kind of a variety of ways we talk about what that choice means, right? So I think one that tends to make sense to kids would be we're saying yes to Jesus, right? Jesus is saying to the disciples, to us, follow me. And that part of what we're doing is saying, yes, I will follow you. That does not mean we have to have answers, right? The disciples didn't totally know what they were saying yes to when they had this
That's
invitation.
right.
And
Yeah.
the same, that you believe this person is worth following. And that means there's still time ahead of you where you will continue to get to know them more and more, and where you will continue to grow into what it means to have made this choice. I think another one that works really nicely for kids is to talk about Jesus as a friend. It's not the only thing Jesus is, but it is a concrete category that kids experience. What makes someone a good friend? What kinds of things, those are friends that listen to you. Those are friends that care about you, who have your best interest in mind. These are all shared with the person of Jesus. That, like, yeah, when we say that we're following Jesus, it's because we believe he is a good kind of friend who will be with us in all these things, and who friendship with Jesus will bring good things for us, because that's kind of who our God is. And I think that can be another category that is not pressuring a kid, which I think is the risk in all of this,
Yeah.
right? That I just don't think fear builds faith. And decisions
Right.
that children make because they are afraid, they often do not look back on those fondly. The more they mature and then they look back on their young selves, they think, "Oh, I wish fear had not been in this recipe of what was happening in the moment." And so being able to say to a kid some things about what God is inviting them into, what are we saying yes to? Those are, and I think keeping those as process. You're saying yes, and we're always growing into what that yes means, like forever, right?
Yes.
And that's okay. So there's not like you must have this all figured out in order to say yes. It's more like what's our minimum viable? What do we know about Jesus? What do we love about Jesus? And then yeah, let's say yes to that.
I don't know if this was a real word, or you coined it and are gonna copyright it, but it's the word kidifying.
I
It
should
it
I
has
should
to do.
copyright it.
There you go. Yes, okay. We're familiar with these children's stories, about Noah and the ark and, Daniel in the lion's den, and that's the wallpaper in the baby nursery and so
Yeah.
forth. But there's also a kind of a dark side to some of these stories, and you said there are some dangers to kidifying some of the stories. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, there I think is a risk with some stories in the Bible that in order to make them the kind of story a child can understand, we have to do some pretty heavy editing. And the Old Testament especially I think is easier to see this at play because it is old. The style of the way the ancient Near Eastern folks wanted to tell stories. It's kind of wild. There's a lot we don't understand, and interesting images and weird ways of phrasing things. And so then, in order for an adult to tell a kid the story, sometimes it means we have to do so much change that we've ended up with this kid version that is really very different than the story scripture tells. And I think that is what can trip us up. And so that's what I call kidifying. It is in contrast to what I would say is just about making a story kid accessible. That's where we maybe
Okay.
paraphrase, that's where we maybe skip some details, like Joseph. It's a very long story. You're going to have to paraphrase it. And so you might jump over some stuff, but you're not changing maybe what happens. And I think that distinction is a really helpful thing for adults to practice. They're looking at a
Yeah, well,
story and wondering what their kids should do, and it's like, "All right, which side am I on here?"
yeah, well, speak to that if you can, because typically when we see some of the Old Testament, I guess, giants of the faith, I think the phrase is like, "Be faithful like Abraham," or "Brave like Esther," "Patient like Joseph," and of course David and Goliath. And I believe you said the hero isn't necessarily David. Tell us a little bit more about where you're going with that.
Well, so many of the ways these stories get presented to our kids makes always the hero is the human. The thing a kid is supposed to do is learn from the human. Did they do something that made God happy or not? And should that child then copy what they see in the human? And if you take just a vignette of David and Goliath, I mean, that is a point where David shows high trust in God being with him, high trust that God is going to come through, and steps forward. And lovely. Also, have you read the rest of David's story? Like, there are some significant issues if we're trying to make him heroic.
Yeah.
And I think that if we put too much emphasis on human behavior and human heroics in scripture, what can get missed is how God is a character in the story. What David has within him as he steps up to say, I'll take on this champion giant, is some knowledge of who this God is that would accompany him, right? And there's some reference in the story when you go looking for saying, if God's an active character in David and Goliath, we see I come before you in the name of the God of Israel who will help me defeat you. And you can say to a kid, God helps us. When have you experienced God's help before? I could tell a kid a story of a time when I felt like God helped me. You could ask a kid, is it easy or hard for you to believe God really does help us? And tell me more about that. Because at some point in David's past, though we may not read the details, he tried to figure out, can God be trusted to be with me and help me? And then this moment comes where he's saying yes. And less than the heroics of his yes and his willingness to fight a giant is there's this process of saying, I believe God's trustworthy in this moment. And that is a process that I think we're inviting our kids into. It's kind of what we're all doing forever in faith is, can God be
Yes.
trusted for real right now? I don't think those kinds of things open up in the story in the same way. If all we're doing is telling kids, look at this human, look what they did right or wrong, learn your lesson from them. When God gets to be a main character in the story too, and when we tell the story looking for what do we notice about who God is or what God's like, all kinds of new layers in the stories open up that I think are often the kinds of things that were on the minds of the biblical storytellers too.
Yeah. I mentioned to you a minute ago, obviously a pastor and a parent like yourself, and I have 3 children. In one of my previous churches, it just seemed like it was like the oasis for all the retired pastors to come and be a part of it, so it was a little traumatic, standing in front of them, but, I remember, I did a funeral for one of the retired pastors, and I got into a conversation with an adult daughter of his, and I'm always curious about what happens in the home, with especially as being a minister. And she said about her dad, who was a pastor. Obviously, she grew up in that life. She said they didn't have scheduled devotionals or prayer time in the home because he felt like they got enough of that already, maybe being part of the church. And I know you spoke to that a minute ago, but do you find that there's a competition or an implied one way for parents to do right in terms of raising their children in the church or with Christian teachings? And is there judgment if you don't?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think some of this is because when the media tools that were available through the 70s and 80s really started to take hold in certain Christian ministries, they were then able to become amplified in pushing forward sort of their one right way. And a lot of that was a model of the family devotional, certainly the weekly church attendance. There were some Sunday school trends coming on the scene with a kind of more memory verse reward systems and so on. There were some midweek programs coming on the scene in that era for kids that would emphasize more Bible time. And so you were supposed to be there. And so the role that I think of media in being able to amplify this particular model really worked against empowering families to say, well, the hope, and this is what I would say, is that you all are following Jesus for real in like beautifully ordinary ways. And that a kid in your family would see that because of your love for Jesus, because of your trust in Jesus, your family lives a certain way on purpose. You respond to challenges a certain way, or you treat people that you come across a certain way. And it's really much more ordinary and everyday. And that I think got a little bit sidetracked by if we just make sure kids know a whole lot of Bible, we can somehow ensure outcomes for those children. And
Right.
it didn't really matter if the kid, for example, struggled to memorize, like that just wasn't a strength. We are gonna make sure they know those things. And then a parent who couldn't do it for whatever reason. Life is busy, challenges come, whatever they feel like they don't know the Bible well enough, whatever those things are, they just were basically like not as good of a Christian parent as the ones who adhered to the stuff. And the thing about it is that nothing research wise has confirmed that that model, one, does what it promises, nor is better than the families who have indeed tapped into their more like the rhythm of life kinds of stuff that faith formation people have been talking about for decades. Families who have a sense of rhythm of life, they actually do better. Their kids kind of do better on the healthy faith front than families that fit the mold. But the volume follows the one size fits all folks. They're louder.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned this also in your book because you said faith could be faked. And I'm
Mm.
kinda getting into either intentionally or unintentionally, children can be manipulated, can they not? Because they wanna please?
Very easily, especially when it's trusted grown-ups. They fear loss, whether they can name that or not, right? They do not want to risk the disapproval or the loss of relationship with a trusted adult. And especially in the very young years, like 0 to 6, you could not really untangle for a kid much. Their view of what God is like and the experience they have of the trusted adults in their life. If there is stability, if there is warmth, if there is love, they are gonna be quick to believe that God is with them and for them and loves them. If there is a lot of shame, if there is a lot of anger, they are going to be quick to believe God thinks those things of them too.
Okay.
And so that connection of a trusted adult's ability to represent faith for a kid for a while until they sort of move into new developmental stages, it means the adult really has a responsibility to um, give space and time and curiosity, and like you're really gifting something when you offer that to kids, because otherwise they'll just do what you say because as they say so. And
Right.
fear is so powerful. That fear of loss, or the fear that you can overtly introduce through poor theology of God's anger and so on.
Well, let me
You
take
could do
that
that.
on kind of in a parallel path, Meredith, because, as you know, a lot of attention has been given to sexual abuse in the
Mm.
church. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe childhood or children's trauma and our spiritual trauma and its, potential long-term impact, because it seems like in the book, it seems to be a focus or an undercurrent, and I was just wondering, could you speak to that?
Yeah. I think that when well, I don't know who the we would be. Let me take a sec to make sure I start this off the way I'd like to, because it's such an important thing. The trauma that a victim has experienced for what was done to them is compounded when those who have abused them are also somehow saying, "Yes, God does know this is happening to you and does not care." Right?
Wow.
Or is on my side as the adult with more power, the one who is able to silence, the one who's able to. And so it means that for a young person to experience something and then to also not know, God cares so much that this happened to you. God is so grieved that this happened to you, even to the point of like, believe me or not, like, it can be hard to believe, but God was with you in a for you sort of way, even in that worst. You were not alone. And for someone who has been victimized to have to revisit all of that and discover God's goodness and trustworthiness through all of that pain and sorrow and grief and loss, we've set them up for such a harder journey in that. And it is made all the more difficult if, in the midst of their truth telling, the rest of the community fails to say, "We are with you in this. This should never have happened. We will embody an extension of God's solidarity with you through our care for you." And I think in the large scale systems that have been continually siding against victims and silencing voices that are truth telling, then you see sort of whole new layers of just misrepresenting who God is and what God values and where God stands on these kinds of things.
Well, building on that, kind of getting back to the metaphor of faith as the web and the strands are God's attributes, and I was going to ask you why you chose goodness. And there are several attributes of God that you used in the book. And I think you said goodness is the umbrella for all of the others, and you can speak to what others you're talking about. But that relates to what we were just talking about. Why would you say that goodness is the umbrella?
One of the reasons I picked goodness is because my expertise focuses on 0 to age 12. And so, knowing in part from 0 to 5, goodness is concrete. If you say you love me, that's abstract. And my brain doesn't do abstract when I'm 2, 3, and 4. If I experience goodness, I know you love me because of the goodness. The goodness is the concrete expression of the love. And so, one reason that I opted to explore the attribute of God's goodness is about kids' worlds being very tangible for their early experiences in particular. The other reason is that a lot of people can say, "I'm doing this because I love you," even while they hurt you.
Wow.
And they can attribute that to God. They can do it themselves. The love must be a good love. And I think that is a very true thing we will find in our God. But I think if I am the parent or the caregiver or the grandparent, when I'm aware that what I'm trying to do for a kid is show like the goodness of this love, not the misuse of the word love, then that gives me a sense of clarity for what I'm offering a young person. And that's part of why I wanted to make sure that one was included in particular, not
Yeah.
because God's love is not our absolutely dominant attribute, but because with children, a lot of them have experienced someone saying the word love and doing something incredibly unloving. But they're pretty good at things that are good and things that are bad are bad.
Yeah.
And so that's why.
Well, you resist I think the language you used was resisting blueprints, but you talk about
Mm,
the importance of rituals.
yeah.
And tell me a little bit about that.
So rituals matter a lot for our faith formation, the stuff that we do on repeat, whether that's weekly as we're part of faith communities or less frequently depending on, what the thing is. What I think is important is for us to recognize repetition matters. The actual rituals are still pretty flexible. So there are certain ones that we share. We celebrate communion together, we participate in baptism together. But then there are these littler rituals like what do I say to my kids when they get out of the car before school? Or when they get back in the car at the end of the school day. And there is an opportunity there for a ritual of life giving words as they leave me and as they come home. But it doesn't mean every family has to do that. Some families, kids, just that is not the ritual they need to pin things on. Maybe they need to really be thinking about their bedtime. There's always a ritual to the way we send our kids to bed. And even in the teen years, I think there's a case to be made for replacing the bedtime rituals of childhood, but still having a ritual of some sort before that teenager, heads off to bed, even when they're rolling their eyes and maybe seems like they don't want it. And so I think being cognizant that repetition matters and often it's really small, but what a family might choose to focus on, the top 3 things that they're like, yeah, we do this a lot. We really make a point of doing it over and over again. Those might vary. It might be about how they celebrate birthdays, tradition year over year, or it might be that they have family reunions in their rhythm that connects them to the aunties and uncles who are also part of faith. And so we make sure that we're there and we're around the table and hearing those stories and, the specifics get to be customized, but there is no denying that kids that just get one-off things here and there have a lot harder time making meaning of why faith matters or
Yeah,
what it offers us for sure.
yeah. From a pastor standpoint, I was curious because you wrote some of this at Disneyland or most of
Yeah,
it, I
good
understand.
chunk. Yeah.
I love this thing you said. You said, and I understand you served at a rather large church and
Yeah, a
ministered
few
to a
of them
lot of
along the
people.
way. Yeah,
Yeah, well, you said that church is not a main dish of fun with a side of God loves you. And I was going to ask about, do you think churches, we don't want to say the word competition.
mm,
We want to say that we work together. But do you think churches can run the risk of maybe importing a little too much entertainment
mm.
or trying to compete in order to reach parents
I
and
think we
kids?
compete sometimes, don't you? We don't mean to, but we
No, we won't say it out loud. No one's gonna hear this,
no, no,
Meredith.
no
It's
one's
just
gonna hear
2
it.
of us.
No, just us, just us. Yeah, there is this like line that I wish we were better at between kids speak the language of fun. Like if you want to be able to be in a real conversation with kids, one is safety. They need holistic safety and two is you need fun. And that doesn't necessarily mean we do entertainment because one is you can't out Disney. This is part of the thing as someone who spends a lot of time in those parks. They're amazing at what they do. A local church, you can't win on that. And it's kind of a little bit of a silly thing to try. But the other thing is that more than like true fun for a kid is not always about the stuff that entertains them. It's about
Okay.
connection. It's about being seen. It's about like laughing together, making an adult laugh. This feeling of pride a kid has when they make a grown up laugh. But that means a grown up needs to be tuned into them and listening to them and giving them their full attention. We could be making a lot of fun together in spaces without it seeming like we have turned on the entertainment factor. And I
Okay.
think that is the invitation for us in local churches is to be thinking through if I'm a kid, is this fun? Not because we're trying to entertain them, but because that's the language I speak. But then also to be mindful, fun has lots of forms for a kid, and a lot of them are way more about who they're with and feeling valued than it is about something that's just whiz bang and blowing them.
Okay. I'm glad to hear you say that, because a lot of times it maybe just seems like we have to, quote, "do things for the kids," but you're saying they can manufacture their own enjoyment just by being together.
I think when you have them together, I think when they have space, I think when they have each other, I think when they realize they're wanted, which I think is the responsibility of the adults in a church, right? Like you are responsible for making sure as best you can the young people in this church know they are wanted. And
Yeah.
so if they accidentally get a little too loud or a little too rowdy or they're running the space, you are the one responsible for making sure you say that to them in a way that does not undercut the fact that you want them there. So maybe they
Okay.
can't go climbing that wall, but you need to make sure you're the one who says that in the way that says, like, "Hey, guys, come on. Like, we know we can't climb the walls. You can go play over there, though. Go have fun." And not, "Hey, get down
Yeah,
from there. You're disrespecting church property."
exactly.
When they are wanted, they will make their own fun. And especially now in our highly digital world, screen-free open space is a gift a church can offer a kid that is actually the very antithesis of the entertainment thing, right? There was a wave coming up where using tech for kids was novel and new. Now there's tech everywhere. The thing a church can offer is quiet and connection and like open-ended play. And so there's this chance to kind of go back to some old school ways we used to tell stories and explore things with kids pre-tech that is going to offer a new gift to kids, even if it's a familiar storytelling style.
Meredith, I was curious. You wrote about interruptions in Jesus's life
Mm.
and how we had to be sensitive to those interruptions. I wondered if you could, there's not a lot of information in the Gospels about Jesus relating to children, but
Yeah.
can we draw some lessons maybe about how Jesus related to children and how children viewed Jesus?
Yeah, we don't have oodles of stories, but we all are pretty familiar with the time that the families are just really trying to get those kids in close to get that blessing to have him touch their heads. And the disciples are the ones to be like, "Hey, he is busy and this is not
Exactly.
important," right? And that especially when we remember the low societal value children held. You have, I think, even just down to if you are where there's high infant mortality and high child mortality, getting attached to those children is risky. Let alone the other ways that rank and class and social structure goes in. You just have this place where welcoming kids in is like, there's nothing to be gained on Jesus's part to say, like, "I'm stopping everything to let these kids come." And it's not just, "No, it's fine, let them come, I can make a minute." It's also that do not hinder them,
Yes.
getting in their way. And I think that doubling up is fascinating. It's not just let them come, it's also do not hinder them. And that pairing for the gospel writers to make sure they kind of tell us both sides of that. Let them come and don't get in their way. It's more than just like give them a sec. It's like, no, really, we're going to do this thing where kids get seen and valued and blessed as an extension of who God is.
That's great. Well, here's my last question, and it coincides with the last chapter of the book. It's called Where Webs Begin, and you offer some practical advice about spinning your own web. And my web doesn't have to look exactly like yours. Can you talk about what that's about?
Because a lot of the pressure on families has been to make their faith look like every other family's and then to be able to mark their kids' spiritual growth in all the same ways. I am really hoping that we are moving towards a paradigm shift where our hope collectively as adults is to keep introducing kids to who God is, but then giving kids time and space and experiences to just keep getting to know God. And I also see so much potential in recognizing the I believe God given uniqueness within our kids. Like they are who God made them to be, and we get to help them become who God made them to be. Also, in our families, that the uniqueness we have in what our family loves, what makes us light up, what gives us energy, but also the challenges we might be navigating and the pain points that we're carrying. So much of what's out there for kids in faith ignores all of that. Your story is irrelevant and your kid is irrelevant. You just do the thing. And I would love to see us collectively as communities of faith saying, like, no, the thing we're trying to do is honor the uniquenesses of children and their families as they get to know God, as they practice what trust might look like in an ordinary sort of way. And I think there's just so much potential in what a kid will experience if adults are saying, like, I am here for you as you go through this process. And then we figure out what it looks like uniquely, right? And so I have kids, for example, just at a super concrete level, they never jived with kids' Bibles. It was just like not their thing. For a few years when they were very young, we had some kids' Bibles and they liked them. And then by like age 6, they were just kind of done. And there's nothing right or wrong. It has nothing to do with whether anyone else's family should be using kids' Bibles as a tool, but mine were just done. And instead, they wanted me to tell them stories. So we do a lot of me telling them Bible stories in the car, which some parents
It,
are like, that sounds horrifying. Please don't ever put me on the spot to be the Bible storyteller. I don't feel like I know the Bible well enough for that at all. And the value that kids need is the chance to explore scripture. The tools are entirely irrelevant. If you are the storyteller, be the storyteller. If it's a podcast, use a podcast. If it's a kid's Bible, use a kid's Bible. Like getting all worked up about whether or not your kid jives with a certain style of thing has only ever left a kid feeling like something's wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them liking the one thing or not liking the other. It does not matter. And so I really hope it shifts more and more towards a posture of freedom that isn't just we can do whatever we want, but We have freedom because God has made us all unique and God does see each of us in our stories and God is guiding each of us on a next faithful step. And so part of how we trust is that we let ourselves look different, one family to another, one kid to another, um, and then see
That's
what
a
comes of that.
Well, let me get you out of here on this. Can you tell us, for those who want to read more about you or follow your work or offer any resources, where can they go or we go to get that?
Well, thank you. So everything could be found if you start at meredithannmiller.com. It's Ann with an E. So meredithannmiller.com has some of the stuff I make. It has links to Woven. It has a link to pre-order the next book I'm coming out with in March, which is a collection of Bible stories that have been paraphrased in kid accessible language, but it has a bunch of study notes for adults about what's going on in the passage so that it can be a tool and resource to talk about scripture more. That's called Wonder. There's an archive of a podcast my kids and I make where we talk about Bible stories together. We've got like 100 Bible stories on a podcast called Ask Away, where they just jump in. They're these fun 10-minute episodes doing different Bible stories. I send out a newsletter each month that's free, exploring different topics related to kids and faith and scripture. And so you can sign up for that. So all those things are there, and hopefully they become helpful resource.
Well, Meredith, I appreciate your generosity of your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have been listening to Meredith Miller, the author of Woven, Nurturing a Faith Your Kid Doesn't Have to Heal From. I thank you all for being part of this conversation today. And as always, thanks for listening.